Namaste and welcome to Detours with me, Anuradha Goyal, where I talk to some very interesting personalities about journeys of all kinds. Namaste and welcome to Detours. Today we have with us Pradeep Chakravarthy ji from Chennai. I don't even know where to start introducing him. He wears so many hats. So let me tell you how I know him. My first introduction to Pradeep Chakravarthy was his book on Tanjore, which I read good 10 years ago. And I used it before my visit to Tanjore. And believe me, my visit to Tanjore was far more enriched because of his book. My second introduction to Pradeep ji was when he came and spoke at the Indica Yatra conference that I had curated, and where he told us a lot of stories of temples of Tamil Nadu, which is what he specializes in. In his past avatars, he's got education at the best of places like most Tamilians do. He spent a stint at the best of brands and corporate world. And today, the avatar he wears is essentially trying to address the gaps that existed in his previous avatars, the gaps that exist in our education, the gaps that exist in our business outlook. And he is today known as a great storyteller, a historian, a writer, and somebody who connects the past to the present and helps us build a future based on our past. So, Vanakkam, Pradeep ji.
Vanakkam Anuradha ji. Thank you for this opportunity.
Welcome to Detours. And as you know that I am a sucker for ancient Indian stories, so I'm going to take you back and ask you, what is the oldest sign of habitation in Chennai?
So the oldest sign of habitation in Chennai is actually not just special for Chennai, Anuradha ji, but it's special for South India as a whole. Because Pallavaram is a small suburb in Chennai. It's very famous because it's near the airport. Over here, more than 100 years back, an archaeologist called Bruce Foote found examples of Paleolithic, Neolithic tools, stone tools. And these stone tools are evidence that this region has been inhabited for several thousand years, 4,000 years, or even maybe even earlier. And these artifacts are now stored safely in the government museum in Chennai. And also in the same gallery is the Adichanallur bronze, which is South India's oldest bronze image. It is of a mother goddess figure. This was found in Tambraparni River, which is much further down south in Tamil Nadu. And the Tambraparni River has its origins in the Kerala-Tamil Nadu border.
But as a site, it no longer exists.
It's still a village. So the village is still there. Outside the village is the mound where excavations have been happening in Adichanallur from about 1850s. In fact, some of the most beautiful gold jewelry from Adichanallur is unfortunately in the Berlin Museum, but the Chennai Government Museum also has some very beautiful artifacts.
Great. So now if we move a little ahead in time, in the times that we know a little more about, my little knowledge of Chennai tells me that there are a lot of ancient temples in Chennai, at least 1,000-year-olds or Chola period temples. So tell us, which are the oldest temples in Chennai? I know some of them are in situ and some of them have moved their places. So just take us through the ancient map of Chennai that still lives on.
So before we get into the temples, it's important to understand why do we have temples at least in South India. By about 1,400, 500 years back, everything that you expected from the government today, the temple did for the local community.
Yes.
Which means the god was equal to the king and the temple was equal to the palace. So the temples therefore were the fundamental organization around which the village was organized. Right. Today in Madras we have Chennai we have different areas. We have Nungambakam, Tenampet, Tampram, Pallavaram, Madambakam, etc. all of these were independent villages in the old days, and all of them had a temple. Now everybody knows the Mylapore Kapaleshwara temple very well. The Kapaleshwara temple was actually on the seashore, and then during the Anglo-Portuguese or the Anglo-French wars, it moved place to its current location. The Tiruvallikeni or Triplicane has the famous Parthasarathi temple. The Kodambakam is a small area now. In Kodambakam is an area called Puliur. Puliur has a tiny, tiny Shiva temple now, which hardly anybody knows. But that used to be the district headquarters during the Chola period. And then we have Tiruvotriyur, which has one of the largest temples in Chennai, and many others.
And all of them are living temples today.
All of them are living temples. We also have Velacheri is a small area not very far off from the Madras IIT campus. It has a very, very rare temple for the Saptamatrikas, or the 7 goddesses. And there are only 3 in Tamil Nadu. One of it is in Velacheri. It is in the place where the road turns, and you wouldn't even guess that we have such an ancient temple of the 8th or the 9th century in that place.
Would it make it the oldest temple in Chennai?
Well, it's difficult to say that, because see, the original temple would have actually been a sacred grove, a tree. It would have been a place of worship or of sacred importance. And then the temple came about. So how do we date temples? Now, the Tiruvallikeni temple we know from 808 ACE. There is an inscription which says that some silver vessels had been sold by the temple during a time of drought, and a man had repledged those and had bought them back. So we know that by 808, the temple was actually a much older temple that has been there for a longer time. Upper Swami sings of the Kapaleshwara temple in about the 6th century and thereabouts. So we know that it was a much older temple there. Tiruvanmiyur, we know, also existed at that time. So we know that these temples existed in about the 5th, 6th centuries. But it's very possible that they must have been even older than that.
Right. So apart from temples, any other buildings or monuments that exist, any palaces, forts, or anything that belongs to the same period as these temples?
Well, in those days, kings were constantly traveling. And they had to travel, because if they didn't travel, then there will be civil war and things like that. So it is very likely that palaces would have been built out of wood, or they might have moved from one place to another, or at best they would have been built out of brick. So we don't have any evidence of non-temple kind of architecture from the Chola or the Pallava period. But we do have references in inscriptions that mention, say, in the Kapaleshwara temple, the original temple is not there in the original location, but some stones are there in different parts in different museums. And we know from one of them that there was a palace in Mylapore, which is a very important part of Chennai today.
Right. And these were what, Chola period?
This would be Chola period, so that's about 1,000 years back.
About 1,000 years back. Now, if we come a little more closer to the present time, we know that Chennai was called Madras till about a couple of decades back. And then it was renamed as Chennai. And my little readings tell me that Madras Patnam and Chennai Patnam are 2 villages which gave the name earlier and now. So can you tell us about the story of the name of Chennai?
Like many other things in India, the stories of names are long forgotten secrets.
Right.
But what we do know is Madras as an entity today. It came because the British acquired Fort St. George, and they slowly started buying up many of these villages from about 300 years back. We actually have records of how much they paid, and the Nawab of Arcot was constantly in need of money. And the British saw that as an opportunity to buy more and more land from him. And that's how all these temples over a period, like in a way, like a amoeba multiplying in a way, that slowly over a period of 200 years, different parts of these villages were brought together, and all of that became Madras. The original word Madras, there are many theories onto why it is called that. Madhyaros was a Portuguese family. It is said that they might have given the name. Madrasa, because it is a place of Muslim education, but that doesn't sound very convincing. But we don't know. What we do know is when people spoke in English, they referred it to as Madras. when they spoke in Telugu, which was actually the more popular language in Madras at that point of time, because all the trade was done with cotton from Andhra Pradesh, and the Dubashas and the traders were mostly from the Telugu speaking group. They called it Chennapatna. So now, of course, when the government renamed it Chennai, they thought they were doing Tamil a favor. But curiously, Chenna is not a Tamil word. It's actually a Kannada or a Telugu word, which means red or beautiful.
Right. There is a Chennapatna near Mysore as well.
Indeed.
Right. So British really had no role in either of the names. The names existed before they came, right?
It is possible, yeah. At least the Madras name, they may have had a role, but Chennai definitely came during the British times.
Chennai came during the British times.
Yeah, because that is the time that we start seeing documents in both English and in Tamil. And you need to remember that before the British came, there was no need to have a Chennai because they were independent villages.
Right.
It is the British who got Triplicate and Mylapore and Egmore and all of them together. And only then did they create, there was even a need for the name.
No, what I understood was that these were also two villages.
No.
No?
Chennai was not a separate village. Madras was not a separate village.
Okay. So that makes sense. And so how did the British or which was the first colonial power to come in Chennai?
We had the Portuguese for a while, Santome, and it was then the British. And the French also tried to, of course, because in the Anglo-French wars, the French lost, which is why Madras and Chennai became a British colony. Otherwise, you would have to speak to me in French.
Yes. So how did the Portuguese found Chennai when they first landed, or the British found it when they first landed here? What was the area like?
So Portuguese we don't know much, but British we know. Why did the British need a trading post over here? And remember, Chennai and Fort St. George is much older than Calcutta and Port William. And Chennai and Madras, or I should call it Madras because it was Madras at the time. Madras was the first capital for the British in India. Only then it was Calcutta, and then it became Delhi. So when they landed here, so the British were always traders for cloth. And they were very keen on the indigo dye and on the kalamkari kind of the chintz work, or the block printed work.
Right.
When they needed a place in the East Coast to manage their trade. And they were finding it very difficult to give the money as an advance to these weavers, then come back after 6 months because the weavers have disappeared or they've moved to another place. So they needed a place where they could actually establish an outpost, where they could stay for a longer period of time, maybe invite the weavers to come and stay and make the cloth in front of them. So when they worked with Andrew Kogan, another person, the Raja of Chandragiri, who was, by the way, a descendant of the Vijayanagar Empire, he agreed to give this small strip of about 300 square kilometers to the British, Andrew Kogan. And they were allowed to establish a small wooden fort, which was called Fort St. George. Okay. That was on the Marina Beach, or what we call the Marina Beach now. And this was a little further from an older Chola port, which was in Trivotrio.
Okay. So can we credit British for this kind of a business setup in this region?
Yes.
Or did it exist and they kind of organized it?
No, I think we can give them the credit for this because this was an international trade. There was always domestic trade and there were small villages. But in terms of bringing the villages together, creating the identity of Madras is something that we need to give the British the credit to. Okay. But each of these villages have a far older history, and that needs to be emphasized.
Okay, so that brings me to another question. My little knowledge of Sangam literature and the ancient Tamil literature tells me that the east coast of India was always trading with different regions of the world, including Europe. So which means that these villages that now form Chennai would also have been a part of the maritime trade.
Some of them, like Trivotrio would have been, or Manali would have been, but not the other villages, because that region of Marina Beach is actually a very, it's got a sharp drop. So ships will find it difficult to come in. But where the Chennai port is, the port area is actually much older than the British times. That was also probably the region where the Chola port was. And we know that the traders were a very important community in Chennai, because from inscriptions from the old temples in the Chennai region, we hear of trade guilds where traders met regularly, they fixed prices, they contributed large sums of money to building walls and shrines within temples, which are all a part of Madras and Chennai today.
So, with such a long history of these villages, tell us about some of the long-standing traditions that continue to live in Chennai.
The Upper Swami is an important Bhakti saint, and when he sings of the Kapalishwara temple, it is actually in the form of singing verses to the ashes of a dead girl. And in that, so one of the I can sing two of the lines in that. Urtirai velai ulavum uyarmayilai. Urtirai velai ulavum uyarmayilai. Kurdarum vel vallar gotran kol sheri tannil. Kardarum solai Kabalishwaram Amandai. Kardarum solai Kabalishwaram Amandai. Adirenal kanade podio pumpavai. Adirenal kanade podio pumpavai.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now you'll have to explain us what it means.
So the legend here is that Pumbavai was a young girl who was deeply in love with the great work that Triyana Samandar was doing in terms of spreading the philosophy of Shaiva Siddhanta. Unfortunately, she passes away, and her parents cremate her and keep those ashes in an urn. And when Samandar comes to Mylapore, he is told of the story, and he sings a set of about 10 verses. And in each of the verses, each of the verses about 4 lines. The first 2 lines, he describes the beauty of Mylapore. So in this verse that I have sung, he talks about how Mylapore is filled with groves of trees that give rain. So Samandar had already figured out how the rains are affected by the number of trees that we have. And he also says Mylapore had many fishermen who used to catch fish by spearing them. And in the 3rd line, he would mention a festival that happened in the Kapalishwara temple in Mylapore. And in the 4th line, he would say, at least for this festival, please rise up from your ashes, Pumbavai, come back from the dead. And it's remarkable that even today, Anuradha ji, all those festivals are still celebrated in the Kapalishwara temple. And in one of them, he even mentions a food prasad that is given, and even that is served. And sure enough, the legend has it, the story has it, that Pumbavai comes back to life, and she wants to marry Samandar, but Samandar declines very respectfully and says he has already wedded to the cause of Shaiva Siddhanta, and he requests Pumbavai to continue to bring many more people back to Shaivism, and he goes his way and he sings of other cases as well. And there is, in fact, one inscription which actually gives us a sense that the female deity, the Parvati deity in the Kapalishwara temple, at one point of time was not called Karpagambal as she is today, but was actually called Pumbavai.
It's interesting that you mentioned Samandar. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. So I found a story in Sri Lanka in a temple called Tirukateshwaram, which is on the other end of Ram Setu. So if we have Rameshwaram at this end of Ram Setu, there is Tirukateshwara on the other end. And that temple was destroyed by the Portuguese. Must have been the same period. And it was completely lost. And about 150 years ago, one guy figured out the poetry of Samandar, in which he had described that temple, and then he went on a mad hunt to find that temple. He found a Chola period Shivalinga, and from that, now the new temple, as big as Rameshwaram, is being built for last 100 years. So that, for me, is the power of poetry, the
Indeed,
power of literature,
indeed.
to
And
bring back the places from, literally from the ashes.
and because Samandar's verses connect so much to nature and within our heart. And by the way, there are at least 3-4 temples, if I'm not mistaken, in Sri Lanka, which the four one of the four Shaivite saints have sung about.
Yes, yes. I've been to most of them.
Wonderful.
Okay, so that brings me to, is there any other kind of poetry that tells us something about the character of Chennai?
Yeah, yes, there is. A slightly more humorous one. This is from an interesting work called Vishwagunardasa Champu, which was composed by Venkatadri Kavi in about the 17th century. And he lived in a village not very far off from Kanchipuram. And he talks about how two mythical beings, two Gandharvas called Krishanu and Vishwavasu, they fly over south of India. They start right down south and they go all the way up to the north. And as they are going, they pass remarks about each of the towns that they are seeing below them. And in that, we get a sense of, in the 17th century, when the British had already come, and Triplicane and Mylapore by that time had already belonged to the entity of Madras as we know it today. We get a sense of what they see over Chennapatnam. Yeah, and Patnam means city, so they call it Chennapatna.
Right.
I'll just read that out. Krishanu says, when tortured by sins like arrows, the afflicted humans bathe in the Kairavam tank, which is the holy tank of the Parthasarathi temple. Then he talks about how beautiful the jewels of the Parthasarathi temple are, and he talks about how devout the devotees are in the Triplicane. And he says that the residents of Chennai are constantly engaged in spiritual matters and live life according to dharma. Now, Vishwavasu is a bit of a pessimist. Yeah. So he says all this may be true, but what is the merit in having a temple so close to foreigners who know no mercy or pity? And he talks about how Chennai, the Patnam, is too cramped, and these Greeks and these Europeans, they don't even give respect to Brahmins as they would give respect to dust. So he's very pessimistic about all this, and he says, what is the point if they don't even wash their feet and they're very hygienic? Yeah, this is quite appropriate in our coronavirus times.
Right.
And he says it's such a tragedy that you've given so much of wealth to these British who are so blasphemous about the Hindu religion, and you've given poverty to the well-behaved Brahmins. And he says the ruling power is with perverts, but the pity is for the wise people who don't have power. And he says beauty is to women of lower value, and devotion is to women of upper value, but they lack the beauty. So he says all the time the contrast is given to the person who is undeserving. But interestingly, in this, always the person who is positive, who's Krishanu, he always has the last word. So I think the Kavi was saying, look, life is going to be bad and good in whatever way you define it. But at the end of the way, to be happy, you take the good and leave the bad. So the last word is with Krishanu. He says, listen, yeah, these Britishers may be bad people and all that is true, but they don't embezzle wealth of the other people. They also have truth. They also settle their disputes in court of law. They invent unusual things. So even among the Hunar or the British, there may be some good people. Let's learn from them and let's move on to Kanchipuram. So moving from Chennai, they fly off to Kanchipuram from there.
Great story, Pradeep ji. In fact, for our listener, I'd like to say that Champu is a category of literature in Sanskrit literature, which combines prose and poetry. And Champu literature is found in almost all old Indian languages: Tamil, Kannada, Odia, Telugu, Sanskrit itself. So great. Now I'll wrap it up, and but not before you tell us one secret thing about Chennai.
Sure. Do you want to give a clue of what kind of a secret you want? Or
whatever, something that we don't know, something that we outsiders do not know.
All right. So Pallava bronzes are very, very rare to come by.
Right.
even in museums.
Mhm.
In Chennai, there is a temple
Mhm.
which is in a village that I've mentioned today
Mhm.
in our talk.
Mhm.
And if you go to the Vishnu temple, it is dedicated to Narasimha. But
Okay.
on the side is an absolutely fabulous bronze image of Vishnu, standing Vishnu,
Mhm.
who's almost about 4 feet high.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not going to mention the name of the temple,
Okay.
but all of you can listen to the recording and make a list of all the towns that I've mentioned in my talk, and look for a Narasimha temple in that suburb, and go and see whether you can see the bronze.
That is a nice way to send us on a treasure hunt.
Absolutely.
Great, Pradeep ji. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk on Chennai and introducing us to the Chennai that not many people know of. I know there are so many other topics that we can speak to you on, and we hope that you'll come back for another talk on another topic. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Anuradha ji. It was a pleasure doing this for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for the listeners, we'll give you links to all the Pradeep ji's books in the description of this podcast, and you can check out those books and use them to travel across Tamil Nadu. Thank you for joining us on Detours. You can also join us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Our handle is IndiTales, INDITALES. See you soon.